Hello, my name's Lucas Kinder. I'm going to be presenting on carbon capture, storage, and sequestration for ARE 445. So really the main purpose of carbon capture, storage, and sequestration is to try to fight some of the greenhouse effect caused by these greenhouse gases here you can see on the chart. Which contribute to global warming and climate change. And the main push is reducing atmospheric CO2 in the energy production sector, manufacturing sector, transportation sector, and also from land use and farming, which contributes to atmospheric CO2. If you look at the graph, a majority of the CO2 comes from fossil fuel use. A nice slice from land use, such as farming, meat production, things like that. We've got a smaller slice here coming from things like chemical manufacturing, more of the manufacturing sector. And then we have some other greenhouse gases. But here lately, the big push, especially with the new government administration, is to reduce these CO2 emissions, especially from the energy production sector. New technologies helping to do this, and we'll cover some of that. So for some current capture methods in energy production, there's post-combustion capture of CO2, there's oxygen-rich environment, fuel combustion, and then capture. And then there's pre-combustion, which also helps with CO2 capture. Each of these have some advantages and disadvantages. There's also other methods, but these three are the most used up to date. There's also several other new technologies coming out for carbon capture, but they're really just in the beginning stages, whereas these three methods are currently in use. So we'll go over those. So we'll cover the post-combustion method of carbon capture. Keep in mind this is in the energy production sector, and the fuels are mostly coal and natural gas with this method. So fuel is combusted to produce heat that creates steam from water, which is used to drive a turbine, electric generator, or generators. This is pretty simple stuff. It's about how every coal or natural gas fired generator works. So CO2 is a large byproduct of this process, obviously. Exhaust gases from combustion exit through smokestacks. Inside of these smokestacks, there's absorber columns, sometimes called scrubbers, and these columns absorb CO2 using solvents such as ammonias. CO2 removed from the solvent is captured, and this process requires extra energy to complete all of the carbon capture. And then once it's captured, it can be pressurized and transported to where it needs to be. There's the oxygen-rich environment fuel combustion method. This is where fuels such as coal or natural gas are combusted in almost a pure oxygen atmosphere. Products of this type of combustion are almost completely CO2 and water vapor. CO2 is collected and transported, and this requires a lot of energy to separate pure oxygen from normal air before it can be combusted with a fuel. This process is called complete combustion, whereas when fuels are combusted in normal air, there's a lot more byproducts other than just carbon dioxide and water. And the pre-combustion method of carbon capture, which is really only used with coal. It's where coal is reacted with O2 and steam under high pressure. Carbon monoxide, hydrogen gas, CO2, and natural gas are produced. They call this syngas. You may have heard of it before. These products are combusted to create electricity, and the remaining CO2 is captured. Current coal power plants cannot be retrofitted. These have to be new plants that are created, and they're very expensive compared to, the old style of coal power plants. So that's one drawback. So atmospheric carbon capture is a little different, where it's not so much within the energy sector, but it's not really in any economic sector. It's its own standalone process, but these new technologies allow capturing of CO2 directly from the air. They're pretty expensive infrastructure, and they require an energy input. This picture here, this one's located in Switzerland, and it actually sends the CO2 it captures out of the air to a nearby greenhouse, which uses it to grow plants and essentially stores that carbon within organic material. We've got large-scale CO2 storage methods. This is mostly underground storage and ocean storage, and we'll cover these a little more. So underground CO2 storage is where captured CO2 is taken, and there's several things they can do with this. They can inject the CO2 at high pressure into depleted wells. Some companies do what's called enhanced oil recovery, where they're not only storing the carbon dioxide underground, they actually use it to displace leftover oil that wasn't able to be removed during the drilling and recovery stages. So that's a plus to that. There's deep aquifer storage, where CO2 is pumped down into a deep underwater aquifer and is stored there. There's also deep rock formations, same concept. The only issue with this is there's eventually leaks. It's never 100% stored. We also have deep ocean CO2 storage, where CO2 is injected over 3,000 feet deep just into the water column. CO2 dissolves into solution at this high pressure. There's also CO2 injection into the sea floor over 9,000 feet deep. And this is where CO2 is actually denser than water at that depth. And it forms kind of a lake on the sea floor. As you can see in the picture, obviously this is not that deep, but this is another sort of example of an underwater lake. The only issue with this is it can kill ocean life. And it's not permanent. There's eventual diffusion back into the atmosphere. We also have biological carbon sequestration, which happens all the time, all over the place, constantly. So there's natural ocean CO2 sequestration. About 25% of human emitted CO2 is annually absorbed into the ocean. Obviously, it's not permanent. It'll stay in solution for a little while and come out of solution, at its own pace. There's vegetation CO2 sequestration. This is where about 25% of global CO2 emissions are absorbed by trees and vegetation. And obviously deforestation and urbanization is a big issue. There's also soil sequestration, which kind of goes along with the vegetation sequestration, where once plants and vegetation dies, the organic matter locks away carbon in the ground. And this can also happen naturally, where carbonates are formed from water containing CO2, percolates through the soil, and stores the CO2 in the soil, but this takes thousands of years. And these are my references. Thanks for watching my presentation.